Hello, this is Mrs. Jackson, and I am using the captioning on Google Slides so you can follow along if you need to. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about today are the components or elements of evolution. And this is going to be kind of like an introduction. So we're going to talk about what evolution is and how we in science understand it. Hopefully you've already completed the evidence for evolution worksheet and the videos that I have had you do last week. If you haven't really done that yet, you might want to do that first before taking the plunge into this video. All right. Also, one of the things that we'll probably be doing with you is doing a review on a Google form for those evidences of evolution. So make sure that you get a chance to do that Google form so that I can take a look at how well you understood that evidence. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is the element of evolution, and that specific element is dealing with variations. So variations are differences among individuals. So we know that this component of the variations that we see in individuals is a really good component that helps us understand the multiple aspects of evolution. You've seen in the pieces of evidence from the previous week that there are many kinds of variations that exist in a species or in like one type of animal. And we, as humans, are a perfect example of that. Humans have variations that we've even learned about in our genetics unit. So our big toes and our hair color and our hair texture, all of these are different variations within a population. Even as you can see on the slide here, I have chromosome 11 where we talked about how there is a version of a blood cell that is sickle shaped. That itself is even a variation in the population. And we know that these variations, when you look at just one species, there are no two species that are alike unless they're identical twins. And in that case, they're identical twins in the sense that their DNA is identical. So, of course, those variations will be identical as well. But outside of that, when we look at all the different species, none of the species are alike. So that's because of the variations within that population. Okay. In this concept, we're going to go ahead and talk about as an organism or a species goes through evolution, sometimes a variation that it has will become a benefit for it over time. And this benefit that there is what we call an adaptation. So it makes an animal better suited for its environment. You guys, in your evidence for evolution, saw lots of pieces of evidence that organism changed over time. And in this example, we're going to talk about the birds and how if you have a bird that's living in or near water, over 50 million years, they may have developed a variation in their feet that allows them to survive better in the water. And so you can see that version of the webbed feet there. So we know that this adaptation or the adaptation in a duck, for example, did not happen in a single lifetime for one duck. This actually has to take millions of years, and we can see these changes in variations in a population in the fossil record. And we can then see that, oh yeah, see, this variation has disappeared. So obviously that variation was not an adaptation because it disappeared from the population. So they don't always have to be something that allows a species to survive. If a variation doesn't help you and it actually is worse for you, then you're going to die and you're going to go extinct. So another component of evolution is what we call fitness. And fitness is surrounding an organism's ability to successfully pass on its genes to the offspring. So as a variation becomes or allows an organism to become more successful, then this causes the organism as a whole to become more fit in its environment. So you can see in this example here, and please keep in mind here that this is not the same as physical fitness, like what you're doing with PE and Swork It. That is not fitness. But fitness is whether that organism, so like we see a bird on the left here that has a lower fitness. That bird only has 2 children, and their 2 children have 2 children, making them less fit for an environment. When you look at the other bird on the right, they have 4 children because they have higher fitness. And so then those 4 children will then have more children. So overall, whatever adaptation that the bird on the right is using to help it survive better helps it create more fitness for it. So you can see my little cartoon there. It says, yum, beetles, they're their favorites, right? So there's lots of green beetles there. But over time, is being a green beetle going to be more fit in an environment? Or will the birds eat them all up and it'll slowly start going away? So the last component or one of the last components of evolution is this concept that we all come from a common ancestor. And so we saw a lot of evidence that helps support this concept. So the DNA molecular evidence helps support that we all have similar DNA to some type of common ancestor. Our anatomy and development helps support that we all came from a common ancestor. So this concept of having descent with modification, and this is where the adaptations and variations come into play, is that each species, as it descends from or away from this common ancestor, it will change. And as it changes over time, the species will change to be something more dramatically different than what its common ancestor was. Okay, so in terms of genetics, what we're looking at here is can evolution change the frequency of an allele in a population over time? So what we're looking at here on the left in the first generation of beetles is we see 75% have the green gene and 25% have the brown gene. And as it moves on to the second generation and each of these beetles are reproducing with each other, you see a decrease in the green gene and an increase in the brown gene. And over time, that variation may change, or there might be something going on in the environment, as in the birds like the green beetles, and those green beetles get eaten up, allowing for that gene to continue to decrease. And this concept of looking at the genetics and how many of the organisms in a population have these genetics is what we consider to be natural selection. And natural selection is one of the main principles in which evolution is guided by. So when we look at this process where organisms become better adapted to their environment, then as they become better adapted, they will survive and produce more offspring. They will be more fit, as we saw with the birds earlier. What we have to understand is natural selection is not acting on the genotype of the organism, but it's acting on the phenotype. So we're looking at not if an organism is big W, or big W. Oops, that got cut off. Sorry. Big W, but we're looking at, are they all white or brown? Are they all green or blue? And so natural selection takes 4 things into consideration. These 4 things that we've talked about, like this process of variation that is in a population, those populations overproducing their offspring. So there's tons of offspring out there with all these different variations. And as they are struggling to exist, these variations are being tested, so to say, whether they are going to be fit or not fit for the environment that they're currently living in. And if they are more fit for the environment they're currently living in, then those traits will be passed on to their offspring and will then be reproduced. And again, the more successful traits will show up and help that species as an overall whole survive. So here you see it broken down into a visual. You have the survival of the fittest, which is where you have 2 different variations competing to survive. Maybe one will be an adaptation over the other. And then if you look at that bigger, we call that natural selection, where all of these components are playing a role in natural selection, helping those organisms survive. And then when we look at those organisms over millions of years, and what do we see surviving and what do we not see surviving, and how do we see those organisms changing over time, this is evolution. Evolution is happening outside of our time frame. It's over thousands and thousands and millions of years that evolution takes place. But it's natural selection that we currently can go ahead and measure and use to help support the concept of evolution. Okay, so the activity that you're going to do today or this week is structured around a gizmo. Now, before we do the gizmo, there is a movie that I'm going to ask you to play in the presentation that I've posted on Google Classroom, so that we don't have to have it on the YouTube video. So it will, if you watch the Google presentation in presentation mode, it will start and then hopefully stop where I want you to stop. You can watch the whole thing, but you don't need to. So here you can see it starting, right? The coolest video ever. Okay? And then it'll stop where I want you to stop. So when you're doing the gizmo, you're going to be doing 3 things. First, looking at variation. That's part A. Then part B is looking at how variations become an adaptation. And then part C is putting it all together to look at evolution. So I hope that you can take this video experience and the movie in the Google slide and the gizmo and pull it together to help strengthen your understanding of how evolution works. All right, well, thank you. I hope this was helpful.